Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa Matthews, the Policy and Campaigns Manager at Young Roots. And I'd like to welcome you all to this joint Young Roots and Helen Bamber Foundation webinar. It's amazing to have so many of you on this call, and it's great to see that so many people care about supporting young people who are going through the age assessment process. Young Roots and the Helen Bamber Foundation, along with many other organisations and experts, believe that too many children have their age disbelieved and are subjected to an often flawed age determination process that too often wrongly finds children to be adults. And this means that children don't get the rights, care and protection to which they're entitled. And at a time when the Rwanda scheme is on all of our minds, and particularly on the minds of the young people we work with and we care about, it feels really important and urgent to be talking about this. While unaccompanied children who are accepted to be under 18 won't be sent to Rwanda, children who are wrongly deemed to be adults will face this risk. And so the consequences of age assessments feel greater than ever. And just to explain briefly, just to touch briefly on what age disputes, age assessments are, and all of our speakers today will talk a bit more about this. In the absence of formal ID, formal documents, the ages of young people arriving in the UK to seek safety are often questioned. They may be interviewed and assessed by different professionals trying to decide how old they are. The Home Office carry out brief assessments when an unaccompanied child arrives in the UK, and if the Home Office dispute a child's age, they might refer that child to a local authority for a full age assessment. If the Home Office doesn't refer the young person to a local authority and treats that young person as an adult, other organisations can refer the young person to a local authority. And it's these fuller local authority age assessments that both the reports we're talking about today focus on. One of those reports is They Made Me Feel Like Myself, which is a joint Young Roots and Helen Bamber Foundation report that's been released this week. This report shows how, when age assessments are required, the process can be improved by using an ongoing, trauma-informed and holistic approach that can allow professionals to build an authentic picture of a young person's age. The report demonstrates the value of organisations and individuals who are working with young people adopting a similar approach in order to increase the likelihood that children will be rightly recognised as the children they are, and to reduce the harm of the age assessment process. And the report also shows that more effective, more accurate and more appropriate age determination processes are possible if the insights and expertise of professionals engaged in this holistic support model are taken into account and given appropriate weight. You'll have been sent a link to the report in the email about today's event, and we'll send it again after the event. And in this webinar, you'll get to hear from Daniel Smith, the Young Roots casework manager, on the partnership that led to the report and the key findings from it. You'll also get to hear from clinical psychologists Angeliki Agariu and Ryan Holmes, who will share their new research for the Helen Bamber Foundation on the psychological impact, the mental health impact of the age dispute process on unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in the UK. And we'll share the link to this research, which has just been published today, by email after the event. We will have time for questions at the end of the session, towards the end of the session, and please put your questions in the Q&A box. It's moderated, so it will only show up when it's published, so don't worry if you can't see your question in that box. If you can, because we're going to take all the questions together, could you say who your question is for, which speaker, or if you can't remember who they are, just say what topic they were talking about. And we'd really love to hear from you if you're also supporting young people in this way or different ways. So in that context, then providing a comment rather than a question is actually actively encouraged. And we'd love to hear from you if you have ideas or interest in how the approach we're talking about today can be taken forward more broadly. But first up, to set the scene for us, we have Kamena Dorling, Director of Policy at the Helen Bamber Foundation, who will be talking about the policy context of age disputes and recent developments. Over to you, Kamena.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks everyone for joining us for this webinar today. It's great to see so many people here. As Lisa said, I work for the Helen Bamber Foundation, and I'm also co-chair of the Refugee and Migrant Children's Consortium, which is a coalition of over 90 organisations working together to promote and protect the rights of young refugees and migrants. I'm going to give a sort of overview of the changes and developments that we've seen over the past few years, and that includes changes in terms of those visual assessments conducted by the Home Office that Lisa referred to, and also the kind of more detailed Merton compliant assessments carried out by local authorities or by Home Office employed social workers. And throughout this kind of summary, I'm just going to kind of touch on some of the concerns that have been raised by members of the Refugee and Migrant Children's Consortium. So the first point I wanted to highlight really is the increasing number of children who have their ages questioned in the first place. Here on this slide, you can see the data from the past few years. This, for various reasons, this doesn't paint a completely accurate picture, but I think it was worth kind of sharing just to see the sort of significant numbers that are having their ages questioned at the moment. And I wanted to point out that you'll see in this table there's a huge jump in 2021. That's not actually strictly about more people coming in and claiming to be children and being disputed. That's because in 2021, for the first time, published data included that group of people who arrive, claim to be children, and are deemed to be adults by the Home Office. So an age dispute is raised and then resolved very quickly because the Home Office does a visual assessment and then routes them into the adult system. But irrespective of that kind of big jump, I think it's really significant to know that this is such a kind of constant issue in terms of children having their age disputed, and arguably we've moved very far away from the idea that you should only have an age assessment if there's significant reason to doubt your claimed age. What we also know is that there are very high numbers of children at the moment who are being wrongly treated as adults under the Home Office policy of treating those whose appearance and demeanour strongly suggest that they are significantly over 18. So usually this would happen on arrival, and as I said, there's a very sort of quick visual assessment before a child is routed to adult accommodation or immigration detention, and then subsequently they may be referred to the local authority in whose area they are, and then that local authority may do their own assessment through a number. As I said before, we don't have disaggregated data, it's all lumped together. So we don't know how many of those published statistics on age disputes, we don't know how many are children who are treated as adults and routed into the adult system, and how many are children who are treated as children pending a further assessment by the local authority. They're all lumped together. So through freedom of information requests to local authorities, we started to kind of gather data on how many are in this treated as adults cohort. And we found that over an 18-month period, over 1,300 children had been wrongly assessed to be adults and then referred to local authorities subsequently. So that's really problematic, obviously, for a number of reasons. We've built up a body of evidence about this over time, and there are some reports on this slide that you might want to look at after this. And those reports kind of highlight poor decision making at the border. They also highlight the fact that it's once the child had been routed into the adult system, it's actually quite difficult for them to get the support and assistance they need to get back out and look into the care of a local authority. One of the barriers is that guidance for accommodation providers actively deters referrals to local authorities. But also what I've heard from a number of RMCC members is that even when a child is referred to a local authority and is accepted as a child, quite often the Home Office push back on that local authority decision. we've obviously tried to highlight the risk of children being accommodated, especially when they're forced to room share in hotels, for example, in adult accommodation. But we now have additional risks from the recent few years as well, including children being wrongly treated as adults and then criminalised for illegal entry or facilitating illegal entry, which is sort of two new crimes introduced by the Nationality and Borders Act 2022. And now, of course, we're seeing the revised risk of children wrongly treated as adults being removed to Rwanda. There's a move away from those kind of initial decisions onto other changes we've seen recently. Under the Nationality and Borders Act, the National Age Assessment Board was introduced. This is described as a decision-making function in the Home Office, which primarily consists of social workers and can conduct age assessments upon referral from a local authority, a health and social care trust in Northern Ireland, or the Home Office. So it's a decision-making body that sits in the Home Office, which was sort of pitched as a sort of an additional bit of assistance for local authorities who are overstretched. But of course, at RMCC, we had a number of concerns, one about the kind of quality of age assessments that would be conducted, another one being about if it sits in the Home Office, what that means for information gathering and information sharing with other parts of the Home Office. And then the third concern was that the Home Office itself can request that the board conducts an age assessment. So you could have a situation where a local authority does an age assessment of a child, and then the Home Office asks the NAB to do an assessment of the child, and the child has two ages. And we strongly argued against that being included in the board's role. There's very detailed guidance online for how the National Age Assessment Board would carry out its functions. And it was launched kind of officially at the end of March 2023. But my understanding is that it's still relatively limited in its capacity. And so on the whole, most assessments are going to continue to be conducted by local authorities. And so there's probably an ongoing issue there about whether local authorities are getting the support they need to do those assessments. Another significant change we saw under the Nationality and Borders Act was the introduction of scientific methods to assess age. I won't go into the many criticisms of scientific methods, but medical bodies are very clear in their opposition to the use of them for reasons of them being unethical, but also inaccurate, I think is probably one of the strongest reasons. Nonetheless, we had secondary legislation that brought this into force now so that they can actually be used. And when I talk about scientific methods, I'm referring to X-rays and MRI scans. And as I understand it, local authorities are being scoped for interest in using them. However, it's probably worth being really clear that the Age Estimation Science Advisory Committee, which was a committee put together by the Home Office to look into the use of scientific methods of assessing age, made clear that they can only be used to see whether the age claimed is possible. So they should only be used as part of a wider social work assessment. They're not going to be some sort of quick fix. They're not going to be used on arrival. They would be used as part of a broader Merton compliant assessment. So the question, in my view, is that given that social work assessments already look at a wide range of evidence, is there a real benefit to an additional kind of hurdle to go through that will be costly and time consuming and can't give you any more accuracy than you might already have got through looking at a range of other evidence? And then another element brought in under that act was the power on the Home Secretary to make their own regulations about how age assessments are conducted. So this was sort of introduced as a kind of response to sort of how complicated age assessments are and the fact that we've built up this kind of process of how it works from case law, and there's lots to kind of to think about. But of course, the Home Secretary making their own rules on it is not going to do away with those kind of very necessary complications. Age assessment is a complicated and nuanced process. We already have guidance in England from the Association of Directors of Children's Services. There's guidance in Scotland and Wales. And as you can see in this quote, I've added in from the slide, when the bill was going through Parliament, we argued strongly that the answer was not to try and kind of write away the complications and the nuances by making regulations. Our concern was this was another example of the Home Office kind of taking over control of a process that should not sit within immigration control, and that actually what we needed is better support and training for local authorities. And finally, moving on to the Illegal Migration Act 2023 now, that brought in a couple of changes that aren't enforced yet, but it's worth kind of being mindful of. One was to remove the right of appeal for anyone who might be removed under the Illegal Migration Act. Actually, the right of appeal never came in. It was introduced under the Nationality and Borders Act. We've not seen it. I don't think we're going to see it. So it's a bit of a sort of tokenistic removal. But what was really significant in that act was saying that while you can challenge an age assessment legally via judicial review, and while that remains, under the Illegal Migration Act, this would not prevent you from being removed from the country. So to go back to our group of people claiming to be children but treated as adults, that decision could be made, you could try and challenge it, and the government could still remove you to Rwanda in that time frame. So this was something that we, as the RMCC, raised repeatedly during the passage of the Safety of Rwanda Act, and is an ongoing concern. A final thing to note from that act is that it also sort of overrules the Supreme Court decision that many of you will know about, where it was said that when you have there is an age assessment legal challenge, ultimately it falls to the court to decide the age of the young person. That's been kind of overturned, but we haven't really seen that play out yet. So that was a kind of whistle-stop tour through what we've seen change. And just to kind of summarise that, really, I think what we've seen over the past few years is a series of changes to law and policy that have given the Home Office increased control over the process of age assessments, which in our view should really only be ever undertaken by experts in child welfare and child protection, should not be falling under the immigration system at all. This is only leading to more children being put at risk. It's not leading to better decision making. And I think it's really worth emphasising that with all of these kind of concerns, the role of local authority assessments is as important as ever. And so I'm sort of looking forward to the discussion about how we can kind of work together to ensure that those assessments are as effective and cause as little harm as possible. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Joanna. As always, a very, very clear explanation of what is actually quite a complicated and multi-layered process. I'm so now going to hand over to Angeliki and Ryan.
Hi, I'm just going to pull up my slides. Can everyone see this?
Yeah, it's not on the start slide though.
Sorry?
It's partway through.
Let's see.
It's the start slide for me.
It's the start slide for me.
Oh.
Yeah? Start slide now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Hi everyone, I'm Angeliki Argiriou and I'm a senior clinical psychologist at the Helen Bamber Foundation and clinical lead of the partnership that we have with Young Roots. Ryan, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, and I'm Ryan Holmes, also a clinical psychologist, previously in post at Helen Bamber Foundation.
So Ryan and I will present to you today some research that we did as part of our partnership work, exploring the psychological impact of the age dispute process on young people that we work with in the UK. This is focused more on local authority-led age assessments. So we are psychologists working with within the partnership with Helen Bamber Foundation and Young Roots, the Helen Bamber Foundation is a charity that works with asylum seekers and refugees with multiple types of needs resulting from histories of trauma and persecution. And Young Roots is also a community organization that is working with young people, young asylum seekers and refugees. And as part of the partnership, we provide clinical and trauma specialist support to young people who present with mental health difficulties. And before we go into the research and our findings, we just wanted to make everyone aware that some of the experiences shared by young people that we'll describe today are going to be difficult to hear. And some of the experiences are critical of age assessment processes and social care in general, and social workers are conducting age assessments. And we just want to be very clear that we don't share this experience to vilify social workers and social care, and we are not suggesting that all age assessments are conducted in a manner that causes significant harm. But we do want to honor the experiences of the young people that we support and to bring and elevate their voices and highlight the harms that can occur within current practice. And we do this with the hope that together we can advocate and work for bringing about best practice in age assessment that can mitigate possible harms and protect the mental health and well-being of asylum-seeking children and young people. A little bit, we're going to start with a little bit of a background, and then Ryan will walk you through the quantitative and qualitative findings from our research. The qualitative findings are summarized into 4 themes that Ryan will explain to you in a minute. And then we're going to briefly touch on some recommendations for practice that follow from our findings. And later, Lisa will be also kind of sharing some recommendations in general that are related. A little bit of a background. What we know is that young asylum seekers and refugees, especially unaccompanied children, present with multiple vulnerabilities and very, very high levels of mental health difficulties, including PTSD, depression, anxiety, difficulties managing emotions, and suicidality. And that is even compared to accompanied refugee children. And what we understand is that there are multiple peri, and post-migration factors that are affecting young people's mental health in that context. Pre-migration factors refer to the reasons that led young people to flee and can be experiences of war and persecution and abuse, and then experiences during their journeys, which can include experiences such as trafficking, police brutality, traumatic separation from caregivers, bereavements, as well as then post-migration factors, including social isolation, language difficulties, challenges with their legal cases, housing, etc. What we have been finding out through our clinical practice and what have young people been bringing to us is that age disputes can be a very important post-migration stressor affecting young people's mental health, sometimes activating mental health difficulties, other times being one of those factors that maintain them or exacerbate them. But there's not much literature like that. There's a few studies, but not much literature in the UK evidencing this mental health impact of the age dispute process, which is why we conducted this research. And Kamen already talked about the political and legislative context and why this is important now if we think about the increase of age assessments being conducted, increase of pressures on local authorities, as well as the maybe a kind of potential more severe consequences that can happen in people's lives with new legislation and policy. And The aim of this research is to better explore the mental health impact of age disputes, but also try to understand how it comes about. How does this process can get under people's skin, given their existing vulnerabilities, and how can it at times be harmful to their mental health? And in order to do that, we compared levels of psychological distress with our existing data between young people that we see that have not been age disputed and those who have been age disputed. And there's also the kind of the key part of the research is the focus group that we run and the experiences that age disputed children and young people shared with us that Ryan is going to talk to you through in a minute. But just a note before I pass it on to Ryan, that this work has been submitted for publication in a peer-reviewed journal, but has also just today, I believe, been released as a report on the Helen Bamber Foundation website and will be shared with you in the chat as well. Pass it on to Ryan.
Thanks, Angeliki. So as we just set out, one of the key rationales for doing this research in the first place was what we were seeing anecdotally within clinical practice, and kind of seeing that it seemed like the young people being referred for psychological input within the partnership were presenting with higher levels of distress that had been age disputed relative to those that hadn't. And so we wanted to kind of explore the data that we had available and see if there was support for what we were experiencing anecdotally. So every young person that comes through for psychological assessment, which is kind of the gateway to psychological input, completes some outcome measures to kind of get an understanding of the baseline levels of psychological distress. So we compared the data of 32 young people who had been or were undergoing the process of being age disputed with 57 young people who hadn't. And the result of that analysis, as you can see on the screen, is that the anecdotal experience we were noticing in clinical practice was borne out in the data. And when we perform statistical analysis on this data, those differences that you can see with higher levels of psychological distress among those who are age disputed were statistically significantly higher than those that were not age disputed, so supporting the rationale for doing this research in the first place. And as Angeliki said, there's not a lot of available data on this experience, so it was felt important to contribute that, and as part of the rationale for publishing in various places as well. And supports this conclusion that the age dispute process can represent for many young people a significant peri-migration stressor and can have a significant mental health impact. As we set out, the kind of main part of this research was acknowledging that we don't have lots of understanding of the specific ways in which that effect might be exerted. So we wanted to kind of give space to the young people that we were supporting and hear from their experience which aspects of the age dispute process do or do not have an impact on their mental health. And the focus group that we conducted with young people who have been age disputed, both those that were and were not found to be a child, ultimately produced these 4 overarching themes, which I'll explain in more detail. And these break down as follows here. And again, as we said earlier, I just want to reiterate the perspectives that we'll be sharing in a moment reflect the experiences of the young people that participate in the focus group, and not necessarily representative of all experiences of age disputes. But at the same time, what we're presenting today is a small glimpse of a much deeper picture, which is described further in the report that we'll be sharing a link to later today, and much deeper within the academic paper that we're in the process of publishing. And at the same time, many of the experiences that we'll be sharing today echo experiences we've seen for many of the young people that we support within the partnership. So the first overarching theme was of the direct mental health impact of the age dispute process, and a key part of this was the experience of prolonged uncertainty and isolation within the process. So young people explained that they felt stuck in limbo, often unable to understand what was happening and unsure of what their future would look like. and with the agonizing wait for an outcome seeming to reinforce a sense of hopelessness, powerlessness, and those experiences being magnified by what was perceived by the young people as a lack of support and a sense of isolation, particularly from peers who didn't necessarily understand the process or what it was that they were going through. And these experiences emphasize the importance of assessments being conducted effectively, compassionately, and in a timely manner, and of the negative impacts of delays that can happen in the assessment and poor communication in the next steps. And some of the experiences that were shared here speak to that. So a young person said, I felt like I don't belong anywhere. I was just sitting in my room all day. Don't even have the energy to go out. It's like I'm waiting on an answer. And the 1 week you have to wait turns into 2 weeks, and how you feel gets worse and worse. Another direct mental health impact reported by the young people was having to repeatedly share your story with professionals. So the process of doing so leaves you feeling vulnerable and is in itself an exercise of trust. When this trust is experienced as being broken due to being met with skepticism, the young people described a significant mental health impact. And this is intensified further by the stresses of having, again, to repeatedly retell your story within this atmosphere of judgment, scrutiny, and disbelief. And the confusion that this seemed to generate for the young people, alongside repeating challenges to the story young people tell themselves about who they are and how they came to be so, also seems to impact identity formation, so their sense of who they are as an individual, which is particularly significant during what is a critical stage of development. So the second overarching theme was of the disruption exerted both during and following the age dispute process. So young people described a breakdown in trust in their relationship with their designated social worker, who is often, of course, one of the key supportive adults and a key pillar in their lives in the UK. The young people described feeling betrayed by their social worker's testimony as they built a relationship with the social worker only to feel like the content of that relationship was then used against them within the age dispute process, leaving them feeling abandoned and uncared for, again, often sadly not for the first time. And it seems that for some young people, this deteriorated further into an adversarial relationship developing between young people and social care, with those who are found to be a child and remain within children's social care describing irreparable damage and distrust, and all participants describing a negative impact on their relationship to professionals more broadly. So the second quote here, I think, really demonstrates that point. So this young person said, social services, they're always against me. Social services is there to help people, but because of that assessment, they're all against me. If I tell them I like this thing, they'll do something completely different than that. Like I said to them, I want to go to the gym. What she did, she found one gym very far away from me. And the second part of this theme was the disruption young people reported from the age dispute process and how the outcomes of that process can interfere with their access to education and secure housing, disrupt their sense of connection and community, and can replicate the severing of important attachments and relationships, similarly to what they experienced when they fled their home countries in many cases. And being found to be an adult can also leave unaccompanied young people in vulnerable situations, such as being placed in accommodation or detention with unfamiliar adults, and often forces them to navigate complex systems like social housing without adult support. So it's extremely important to acknowledge the importance of secure and stable living arrangements for the well-being of unaccompanied children and young people, and the importance of stability and consistency throughout the age dispute process. And we'll touch on that in the recommendation section later. And again, experience that speaks to that process. When I was found to be an adult, they took me out of foster care and then put me in accommodation for adults. I can't live there. It's like a prison. It's not a house. They told me you have to take your assigned age and then you have to apply for social housing. We're going to change the key. You're going to be homeless. And I don't know where tomorrow, where I live. So the next overarching theme was what young people described around examples of what they experienced as inappropriateness and misunderstandings within the age dispute process. So the young people highlighted how there can be an overemphasis on physical characteristics, including scrutiny of their appearance, mannerisms, and even the most minute behaviors, such as how they sat in the chair, leading to a sense of frustration and feeling overanalyzed. This also seemed to extend beyond physical traits to include aspects of the young person's character, such as confidence and perceived maturity, without considering the experiences that have shaped these qualities. So it's felt by the young people that the experiences of trauma and adversity that they had endured were not adequately taken into account, leading to a sense of injustice within the process, particularly if they were concluded to be an adult based on those factors. And again, a demonstrative quote, because then I hadn't grown a beard, I looked young, but my voice was very deep. And they said, you have so much confidence in you, the way you speak, you don't skip any words. And I was like, it's because I've been living on my own since I was 12. I've been feeding myself, I've been going to work, come back home and feed myself. What do you expect? Do you think that's a joke? That's not a joke. Relatedly, the young people also seem to highlight an underappreciation of the consequences for development of the varied social, cultural, political, and economic contexts that unaccompanied children and young people existed in prior to their arrival in the UK. They emphasize differences between what it means to be a child and what it means to be an adult in developing versus developed nations, with children in developing nations often demonstrating greater independence and maturity relative to, for example, British-born children through necessity and hardship. So many of the participants shared experiences of starting work as early as 10 years old, forcing them to cultivate independence and self-sufficiency from a remarkably young age. And despite this, their maturity was often misinterpreted through the lens of Western norms, where rather than being a consequence of these life experience, it was perceived to reflect a more advanced age than they were reporting. So again, an example of the quote, I didn't grow up British, I've been passing through so many countries, so many problems on my way, so I have to be strong. I don't have to be like a kid, I don't have to play with the toys. In Africa or other country, if you went there, they're going to marry in 16 years old. In 17 years old, they're going to have a kid. So do you think that they're going to play with a toy or something like that? And the final theme that young people experienced within the focus group was a sense of hostility and threat, both within and following the age dispute process. So a unanimous experience shared was the sense that the questions were intentionally designed to catch the inconsistencies in the story, fostering anxiety and fear that increased the likelihood of errors within the process. And these fears were compounded by a presence of multiple unfamiliar adult professionals, exacerbating the feelings of isolation and opposition. And the young people reported this creates an intimidating, hostile situation that's particularly challenging for children and young people who are new to the UK and who often are still learning the language and cultural norms. So, for example, they're not trying to know you, they're just trying to get the lie. They're going to ask you one question in two ways, and if you didn't say the exact same word, they're going to say that you're lying. You're not going to then answer the next question correctly because you're going to be confused. And finally, young people also described a persistent sense of being unfairly regarded as deceitful and attempting to manipulate the system to gain access to rights to which they weren't entitled. So this perception not only affected their interactions with social care and other professionals, but also hindered their willingness to seek out support when they needed it. Participants also highlighted adverse effects on their mental health and well-being, with some even reporting experiencing suicidal thoughts. For some, this perceived dishonesty appeared to result in punitive treatment, including threats of arrest, detention, and removal, which contributed to fears regarding the potential repercussions of the age assessment on their pending asylum claims. So, for example, it's really stressful, then they tell you you're lying, like it might make you want to kill yourself, like you think like that. Yeah, I'm serious, I'm 4 years, I'm waiting. Like I told everyone the truth when they say I'm lying until now. Like I've never told them another age, but they say your age is like this. And they said they would call the police to me as well. If you don't accept it, you might go back to your country. You have to go. Otherwise, we're going to call the police. But I was scared. I said, okay, I'm going to go.
Thank you, Ryan. So just briefly, some of our conclusions from the focus group, and there's like lots of more powerful, very powerful things that young people said that you can find in the full report. But for now, we just want to touch on some conclusions. Our concern that we're aware is shared along many social workers that are conducting age assessment is that the political current that underlies age assessments can lead to the best interest of the Home Office taking precedence over the best interest of asylum-seeking children and young people. And as you have heard, their experiences of these young people that we've worked with, not only the people that were in the focus group, but kind of those people mirror the experience of lots of young people that we have worked with clinically, suggests that the age dispute process can have a significant negative mental health impact. And these negative consequences can at times be long-term and affect the way that young people build relationships and adjust educationally and socially and in many other ways. We're also concerned about the negative impact on well-being and of social workers that are conducting these assessments. And there's this concept of moral injury, the harm that can be caused to workers that are forced to use practices that don't align with their ethical principles and the way that they have been trained and the aims of their profession. So our hope is that we can advocate in shifting away from chronological age being the only determinant of the support that is given to young people with these vulnerabilities, and more of a focus on individual needs, and as well as generally trying to protect the key principles of best interest, benefit of the doubt, and informed consent in accordance with the British Association of Social Workers guidelines. We support and answer the recommendations of the Refugee and Migrant Children's Consortium, and those are part of our report that is being published today, and you can read the full list of principles there. I think Lisa is also going to share them later today. But what we wanted to emphasize that follows directly from this piece of research is that there is need to work hard in making sure that age assessment processes emphasize and prioritize a trauma-informed approach that includes creating supportive and non-confrontational environments during age assessments, making sure that building and maintaining trust and emotional safety is given real consideration, as well as the impact of trauma and mental health vulnerabilities that the young people come with is acknowledged during the design and the implementation of age assessments. And as well as the emotional impact of retelling one story and how difficult that can be for young people, especially if that also comes with a feeling of being disbelieved, and that sharing one story can be used against you, and the long-term impact that this can have for someone's mental health and well-being. And again, also an emphasis on maintaining dignity and as well as a consideration and sensitivity to ethnic and cultural background, as well as other individual factors like gender, learning needs, and many other things that young people come with on top of chronological age. And then very crucially, when young people are found to be children at the end of an age dispute, for there to be a focus on mediation and repair of the relationships between children and social care, so that young people can engage with social care in a meaningful way and get the support that they need. There's a couple of references there. What's not there is the report that we published, but that's, I think, is going to be shared with you today. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for that. And please do put any questions you've got for any of the speakers so far in the Q&A box. I think it's fair to say that it wasn't always easy for the young people involved in this research to share those experiences of the age assessment, age dispute process. But I think it's just so important that we so rarely get to hear those voices, and I think it's really important that we, as you say, honour it, and thank you for the work that has gone into that, for sharing that. And we will be sharing that research by email after the event. And I just wanted to pick out one quote that struck me in from a young person, which I think links to what Dan's about to talk about. A young person said about the age assessment, "You have to give time to know a person. You can't say someone is, you can't tell someone's age within 1 hour or two, you know?" And I think there's a lot to be said about the kind of longer form holistic approach to supporting young people that we think can add so much value and increase accuracy, but also reduce harm in this process in the last resort cases when age assessments do have to happen. So I'm going to hand over to Dan now, who's going to talk about the joint report that was launched this week.
Thanks, Lisa. Can everyone hear me? You hear me? Yeah, okay.
It's a bit quiet, if you can up your volume a bit.
Okay, let me see if I can share my slides. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, hi everyone, my name's Dan Smith. I am the casework manager for Young Roots in Northwest London, in Brent. I've been working on the partnership project, which we call the Hub, with the Helen Bamber Foundation since 2019. It's almost exactly 5 years since we started it, so what better time to reflect on its work. Essentially, we've put together a report together explaining how the partnership works, how we think it supports young people generally, and especially how it supports age disputed young people going through the age assessment process, how it's beneficial to them in providing a support network and a safety net for them, but also how it's potentially benefit for people trying to assess age. Okay. So a little bit about the partnership of the two organisations in it. Young Roots is an independent charity. We support young people seeking asylum in London. We have projects in Brent, where I work in Northwest London, also in Croydon in South London, and a newer project in King's Cross. The Hub model is replicated in the Brent and Croydon projects, and it will probably in time be implemented in King's Cross too. Young Roots specialises in working with unaccompanied children and young people, so children and young people who are here seeking asylum without their families. The Helen Bamber Foundation, I won't go into too much detail because you've heard a lot about the brilliant work that they do. They're a specialist clinical human rights charity that work with survivors of trafficking, torture, and other forms of extreme human cruelty. And obviously, there's a lot of crossover between those two client groups worked with by the two organisations. They have a model of integrated care, which involves legal services, medical legal documentation of physical and psychological injury, community integration work, counter-trafficking work, and crucially for us, specialist psychological therapeutic care, which is what we work with them on. So the age range that our partnership and the Hub works with is 11 to 25. The vast majority of the people who engage with our services, however, are around 14 to 21, I would say. And different parts of the model are engaged with slightly different cohorts and age groups. It's a three-pronged, three-spoked kind of service with youth work and activities, casework, and therapy. We also have legal partners that we also refer to, provide legal advice and representation. on matters such as housing, immigration, asylum, trafficking, and community care. Yeah, so there's some numbers there for you to show roughly the sort of number of people that we work with. That's for all of Young Roots. We work with people from all over the world, and roughly we're working with about 100 people a week at any one time. And in the summer, in particular, that can increase significantly. The group of people that we work with can be divided roughly into 3 groups: as looked after children, care leavers, and young adults. And then obviously a 4th category of age disputed young people undergoing local authority age assessments or disputed by the Home Office, who aren't neatly fitting into any of those categories yet. So a little bit about the hub model. As I say, three parts to it, 3 main parts to it. The youth work and activities led by youth workers, and this involves sports teams, ESOL sessions, various workshops, and youth club projects that might involve photography courses or campaigns. These are led by youth workers who tend to be the kind of front-facing, immediate first point of contact for young people accessing our services. And youth workers tend to can often maintain professional working relationships with young people for many years. So that's the real sort of core of the work is through youth work. And then we have a casework service that offers practical and emotional support to young people in accessing services relating to legal representation, education, housing, medical services, and welfare support. And that's one-to-one work, normally for 6 months or more, helping people to resolve practical issues. And it involves a lot of independent advocacy, speaking to other services, and networking on behalf of young people, I suppose. And there's the therapy service delivered by Angeliki and Ryan and others from the Helen Bamber Foundation, which has a variety of services, but primarily stabilisation, teaching young people coping strategies for dealing with their symptoms, and trauma-focused therapy for PTSD survivors mainly. And I won't go into any more detail on that because they are much more expert than I am on those. Okay, so essentially the hub is most effective, we think, because it is so accessible for young people. This is key to its success. Essentially, a young person could arrive, for a homeless young person could arrive and to come and play cricket, and within a few weeks they could have a group of friends who they play cricket with, be engaged in weekly English lessons, have a caseworker who's trying to resolve their homelessness, and also be referred to for a mental health assessment, where they can get diagnoses and treatment for their conditions. And all of this can happen very, very quickly. Yeah, and I think that what's special about it is that it's all these services delivered under the same roof, in the same place, at the same time, every week throughout the year. So it's really, really consistent service. And it's a suitable space for teenagers and young adults. And what we found is that people move around those services a lot. There's a lot of constant internal referring between those 3 services. And what's been a really brilliant thing to realise from this work is that young people themselves are destigmatising mental health amongst their peers. So young people are encouraging each other to engage with mental health services. They're sharing coping strategies, and recommending mental health services to each other, which is really remarkable, I think, and unique. Yeah, and I think all of this really works because we bake in a trauma-informed, compassionate, and young person-centered approach to all of the work that we do. I know these words are sort of used a lot, and often it's quite difficult to see what they mean in practice. But I think a really good example of that is that we sort of recognise that young people who are traumatized might be avoidant of spaces where they have to talk about and engage with those feelings and memories, for example, a therapy session. And so if a young person misses a session, our service is tolerant of that and understanding of that, and they will not be immediately discharged from that service. Ample opportunity will be given to them to re-engage. And what we find is that over the long term, people who really need that support are then able to get it. Youth participation is a sort of founding principle of Young Roots, and young people are leading all of our activities and the direction of our activities. And we have lots of volunteering opportunities with young people refereeing sports teams, for example, and that kind of thing. And I think that's really imperative as well, because it just ensures that the service is what young people want. Has that gone to the next slide? Yeah, okay. So age-disputed young people in particular, essentially what we're doing is we're engaging age-disputed young people on the basis of their claimed age in age-appropriate activities. And we're essentially, what we're finding is that when you do that, young people are better able to demonstrate that they are the age they claim they are when they're given opportunity to engage in services that are suitable for their age group. One of the key things that we think is really important in this model is that we provide a peer group. Young people are able to associate with people of their own age and be observed doing that. We think that obviously that in age assessment, there's a lot of indicators that are really quite unreliable and varied, but who your mates are is a pretty good indicator of how old you are. And we're in a space where we have young people of various ages. And so we're able to observe how young people interact in those groups, who they gravitate towards, who they're accepted by. And we think this is useful, really useful to people trying to determine age. And it's often perhaps something that's often not available to people trying to assess age. The casework service is long-term, one-to-one support. That tends to be a one-to-one relationship with an individual professional and a young person, supporting people in a variety of environments and situations that could vary from formal legal appointments to registering with GPs to enrolling at colleges, but it also involves lots of perhaps like informal downtime, waiting for a train that's delayed, going for lunch together in between appointments. And this is really where you get to understand a young person in a nuanced way. Yeah, so I think across this service, young people are really able and encouraged to behave authentically and to be authentically themselves. It's a relaxed environment, which it contrasts the environment, I think, in which most age assessments take place, such as an interview or a series of interviews. I think, lastly on that, I think the psychological conditions and diagnoses and symptoms, which we're able to document through the partnership, have been really valuable to assessors in recognising and understanding young people's presentation. I think, yeah, so here's a little bit of data. I hope you can see that if it's big enough. So essentially what we did was we took the data from age-disputed young people who engaged with all three parts of the project. So there are young people who are age-disputed who have engaged with, say, youth activities and therapy, but never had a caseworker. So we've not included them. Essentially what we found is that people who engage with all three spokes of our model are more likely to have their ages accepted and be able to demonstrate their age. In a lot of cases, this doesn't involve us giving any observations. It's just that young people are more supported and therefore better able to engage in the age assessment process. And in some cases, it involves us providing our observations to the local authority or to the court, tribunal, and explaining our experiences of working with that young person, our observations of working with that young person, which we found have been really helpful to decision makers. I think the report is available on our website now and will be shared, has been shared in the emails as well. I think if there's one area of the report, if you didn't want to read the whole thing, then I would encourage you to at least scroll to the latter pages where we have case studies, some 3 really good case studies that sort of demonstrate how this evidence has been used effectively to get young people their right age and to assist decision makers in assigning that age. Yeah, so I would encourage you to do that. Yeah, so just to wrap up, really, I think the 3 things we've recognised is that age-disputed children are better able to demonstrate that they are children when they're properly supported to do so, and provided with age-appropriate, suitable conditions and services. And the second thing is that age-disputed young people often demonstrate their age in more nuanced ways than age assessors are able to observe in an interview setting. And on that basis, we really encourage age assessments, people conducting assessments, to engage professionals who know the young people well and ascertain their observations of that person in more nuanced ways and environments. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Dan. I think that's just a great explanation of how the partnership works and what insights we think it shows, and also I think maybe brought us some much needed kind of joyful moments as well when we think about what young people can achieve through that partnership and through that support. So I think it's probably worth just reiterating what we've kind of all been saying, that as organisations, as the Refugee and Migrant Children's Consortium, we believe that too many young people are being age assessed, that the guidance is that it should be done as a last resort, and it's become almost routine. And the benefit of the doubt should be given to the child. But when age assessments do need to be done, for example, to make sure children are protected, then there's lots of kind of value from thinking about this holistic trauma-informed model as a way of understanding a kind of authentic age of a young person, and that there are organisations using this approach, and that maybe those insights from those organisations are not always given as much weight or significance as perhaps they could be. So when age assessments do have to happen, there are lots of ways in which perhaps they could be done in a more trauma-informed and child-centred way, and we think the report sets out quite a lot of that. And I think the mental health research shows that unfortunately too many children aren't experiencing that. And also just to be clear that that there are these two different kind of sides of the age assessment process, the Home Office side and the local authority side, and we really do believe that social workers are the experts about children, they're the experts about child safety, and we really want social workers to be allowed to do their job of protecting children as the experts that they are. Before we go on to look at the kind of more broad recommendations that we've been mentioning a few times, we have got a couple of questions that we can take already. So one I think is specifically for Angeliki and Ryan, and then one I think is maybe a bit more, could be answered by a few more broadly. So the first question is, what parameters do you use for measuring psychological distress in young people?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's never enough time to talk about it in detail. So that gives us the opportunity to do that. So we conduct quite lengthy as well assessments ourselves. So usually it's like however time it needs. So they're kind of structured as semi-structured interviews assessing mental health difficulties, including more often than not what we know how to do best. So assessing PTSD, assessing depression and anxiety, which are the most common difficulties that the people we support present with, as well as emotional regulation difficulties. And we use psychometric tools like the one that we kind of presented data from. So we routinely use them at assessment, but also before someone does therapy and after they do therapy. But we also use our interviews and our kind of like a more unstructured clinical interview skills to assess mental health difficulties.
Ryan, did you want to add anything there? Okay. And just to say also, thank you for people who are using the chat as well, just to kind of put their email addresses if they want to be kind of make contact with. That's really useful. Thanks. I won't publish those unless you ask me to, because that might just be for us as presenters. So the next question I think can be answered a bit more generally. It's from Dan, who said, not Dan who presented, the idea of avoiding confrontational approach and creating a supportive environment is not new in local authority age assessments. It's emphasised in the Association of Assistant Directors Guidance from back in 2015. And it's sad to hear that many young people still feel attacked and coerced during their age assessment despite this guidance. It's interesting to hear some of the reasons this might be happening from your research. So I think maybe Angeliki and Ryan might have something to say, but also Dan, do you have anything to say on? I think it's something we talk about quite a lot, that there is good guidance, but why is that not always what's happening in practice?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, if you like.
I think the ADCS guidance is really strong. I think we support it absolutely. I think what we've found in recent years, and maybe Camilla can also comment on this, is that this move away from age assessment as a function of social care and towards a function of immigration control, and that's certainly what young people are telling us and how they perceive age assessment. So you're right that none of these things that we're commenting on really are particularly new. It's about trying to reframe and revise our approach to age assessment back to best guidance, best practice. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else has anything else to comment on that.
And I think it's just important to kind of highlight that it is, I mean, I'm not an age assessor, but I imagine that it's a really, really difficult balance to strike. And I think what makes it more difficult than what we wanted to emphasize with our research is that these are very vulnerable young people that would have experienced lots of interpersonal trauma, and they would have been maybe interrogated and maybe have experiences of being abused by primary caregivers as well. So their levels of threat will be higher. So even though assessors might make lots of good efforts to have a supportive environment, there might not be and they might not be aware of these experiences as well, and how they can increase those levels of threat, and how they can trigger young people, especially if they perceive that they are being over scrutinized or tried to be caught in a lie, as some of the young people said.
I come in quickly. I think it's a really interesting question, and I was just kind of, and this is my sort of speculation more than anything, but I remember years ago there would be lots of conversations about whether or not age assessments should be conducted in police stations, right? We don't have those anymore. That was the sort of days of, I think, lorry drops, and that being the kind of way that children would come to the attention of local authorities. And now we're in a situation, and this is not everyone, and not necessarily the context of all of the young people that Young Roots working with, but we're now in a situation where, for example, you've got attempts to move children out of adult accommodation and then they refer to a local authority, and when does that assessment take place? And you don't want it to be too long because they need to be moved, but how quickly does it happen? I think you have this kind of constant tension between needing decisions relatively quickly because they impact on all these other areas of the young person's life, but then not wanting it to be so quick that you lose all of those benefits of building relationships and getting kind of input from other people interacting with that young person. And so I think that might have something to do with it. I guess the other thing that cropped into my mind from that question, and again, if anyone had any comments they wanted to share, I'd be really interested, is we keep hearing, specifically in the context of the Association of Directors of Children's Services guidance, which I was involved in when it was drawn up, I keep hearing a relatively negative presentation of that guidance, and I'm interested in as to why, because it needs updating in terms of case law, but actually the fundamentals of it still stand. And you sort of, certainly from the Home Office, it's like, oh, this is the whole, goes back to this point that I was making at the beginning about the sort of Home Office desire to codify age assessments as if the existing there's something wrong with the existing guidance. And so I just wonder the extent to which, how it's perceived, how it's being used, because if you've got that constant rhetoric that it's not sufficient, I'd be interested if anyone had any thoughts to share on that.
Any other thoughts from the presenters on this question before we move on? Got a few more coming through. Yeah, Ryan.
Just super briefly, which hopefully will tie into thinking about the recommendations, is that I guess that's the next step from certainly from our piece of research, is that our focus is less on individual age assessors and those that are conducting the assessment in that specific way, and more on what are the systemic pressures that are creating the environment where experiences like this can happen, and with the hope that both the research findings and the recommendations that we're going to be talking about in a moment hopefully will support the process of pushing back against some of those systemic pressures and making it more possible to conduct age assessments in the spirit with which they're intended.
Thanks, Ryan. A bit of love here for Young Roots and the work that the partnership is doing, and a question for Dan. How big is the team and how many people are involved in each part of your hub? Thank you for the amazing work you do.
Thank you for that. So it varies really, depending on how many people are attending. But I mean, we're now consistently seeing above 50 people come every week. In the summer, cricket and football goes a bit crazy because everybody wants to play. So I would say that, and it's also made up of lots of different bits. So core staff, I think we have 5 people there every week, but in addition, and so that would be made up of a caseworker, somebody doing reception, sometimes 2 people on reception, 2 youth workers doing the activities. There might have, but in addition to that, we might have an English teacher doing an English session, or sports coaches coming and running football sessions. Psychotherapists are upstairs as well doing their therapy sessions. So it actually gets quite a lot of people. And in addition to that, we have volunteers coming in and doing bits here and there. And increasingly, we have young people taking on roles. I think I mentioned young people are now refereeing football, which is, mixed results, but interesting. So we're kind of trying to pass over as much of this control, much of these roles to young people. So I would say on average, probably about 7 staff at the hub at any one time.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think it is worth emphasising it's not a low resource thing to do, because it is just so holistic and intensive, and because so much care and thought and involving young people to that level requires a lot of support from staff as well. And I think I would never want to downplay actually how much kind of that requires, but we just see such important results from it that I think it's really worth investing in. A couple of just logistical points. Someone's asked if the PowerPoint slides will be shared, and they will. And a comment from Claire in response to what you were saying, Kamena. Yes, I've been hearing the same about the ADCS guidance, which is concerning. As you say, the fundamentals still apply, and I think, as we talk about quite a lot, with good guidance, you also need the kind of cultural environment to be able to put that guidance into practice. And I think when the culture is becoming increasingly politicized, that's much more difficult. And I think we really believe that politics needs to be kept out of child protection, that children's safety is what matters. And there's changes in practice that we're talking about here today, and we also want the Illegal Migration Act and its provisions on age assessment to be repealed. We don't think the National Age Assessment Board is the way for age assessments to be done. So there's a lot of things that can definitely be changed, as well as this kind of maybe more nuanced, different way of working that we've presented in the report. Quite a big question, but I think a really important question as well from Athena. How would you suggest that practitioners best support age-disputed young people to support themselves? We try to provide emotional support, but delays in age dispute processes and inherent systemic unfairness make it difficult to make young people feel hopeful, especially if we do not have a background in psychology or social work. Would anyone like to tackle that really important but quite tricky question?
It's really hard. I mean, I think even for us that we have the skills, it is really difficult because it can feel very hopeless, and it can feel like really like young people tend to see kind of current situational problems as like the kind of time passes differently when you're young, right? And also you're kind of very focused on what's going on now in your life as basically the one thing that is kind of like destroying everything. And that is going to be even kind of more magnified if you have existing mental health difficulties. So it can be really, really tricky. But what we found that it does make a difference to have those supportive adults in your life that you're able to talk to about the process, even if they're not going to be able to kind of help you solve it, but it's to kind of have that support, and also giving them a sense of agency and like skills to control the things that they can't control in their life, while the things that are outside of the control are ongoing. So kind of encouraging them to engage with education, to develop social relationships with peers, to attend organizations and activities, and to not be isolated really, and feel that some things are moving in their lives, even if the other things aren't. But for lots of young people that we do see, unfortunately, they feel unable to do any of these things, and they feel quite stuck by the processes. So it can be really tricky. And in those situations, I would encourage that you kind of like support people to access mental health support.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think I agree with everything that's just been said. I think essentially build a network as best as possible, build a network for that person that is sustaining, that will be sustainable beyond an age assessment, and is not totally dependent on their age. So that can be mental health services, it could be youth services, friends, just building, enabling people to make friendships is a big part. So I think a lot of age disputed young people feel ostracized from services, and isolated by services, as though they don't belong and that they're not fitting in. And so the more you're able to build that network that is going to be there regardless, the more at home people will feel more relaxed, the more then better able to access and engage with the age assessment process when it has to happen.
Yeah, something I'd add to that, mainly because it's a complete kind of obsession of mine, is that young people often don't really understand what's happening to them. They're confused by the process. It's a confusing process. I've even found, talking to people who don't know about the process, it is hard to explain. But I find, and we certainly find it in Roots, that young people really don't know what's happening, why it's happening, why certain decisions have been made, maybe what they could have done to be in a better situation. And I really, really believe that's a vital part of young people having a kind of more positive experience of this process, is knowing what to expect, knowing what they can do, knowing what their rights are. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done around that as well. Anything else to add on that, supporting young people to support themselves? I think these questions are probably for Dan. What is your referral process?
Okay, so people can be referred to us via our website. We prioritize people who don't have other support networks. We prioritize asylum seekers over refugees, but these are loose prioritization, they're not strict criteria. And we also aim to work with people in our localities. So people need to have access, be able to get to us, to see us face to face in the areas that we work. We get a lot of referrals via our website, but also from other practitioners and professionals. I would say actually probably the majority of people access our services because their friends bring them along and tell them to come. So that's probably actually the most that is possible. People can just turn up at our youth clubs. And the other thing I'd say is that to access the mental health support, young people have to be accessing youth work or casework at the same time. And that's just so that we can provide a proper support system for each other as well as for the young person.
Just to add, sorry if you did say this, Dan, I was flicking between reviewing questions and listening, that we also, because of the projects we have in asylum hotels, that we meet a lot of young people. That way our youth welfare teams work with young people, and we have specific drop-ins for young people who are in asylum hotels as well. So we have a kind of particular reach in those boroughs that we work in around that as well. I think it's another question for you, Dan. What links do you have with local social services, virtual schools, exploitation panels, etc.?
So we do work with social services a lot, and those the other services that you've mentioned. We'd like to work more closely, I think, and we'd always be open to that. I think also there's kind of two categories of age disputed young people that we're working with, and some of those people are people who are in care, who have access while the assessment is ongoing, and they have more access to those kind of services. But there's a huge cohort of age disputed people that we're working with who are outside of the care system, trying to challenge their age assessment, trying to get an age assessment. And so those people, it's much more difficult to get them access to social services, virtual schools, exploitation panels, etc. And a lot of that, a lot of the safeguarding, education, health services, we're having to either refer to ourselves or provide ourselves. So I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a bit of a frustration that this huge cohort of people aren't able to access those services. But yeah, in general, we do work with those kind of people, and we'd like to work more closely with them.
I think we might move on to talk about recommendations now, but please do carry on adding your questions. If we have time at the end, we'll take some more. So I had better figure out how to share my screen now. So we've talked all the way through really about the recommendations for fewer age disputes, but also then fairer age assessment processes when they happen. And I think it is important to return to this, given, as I mentioned at the start, there's just such big there's always been big consequences if children are wrongly deemed to be adults, but it just feels like the stakes are even higher. So I'm just going to share what the Refugee and Migrant Children Consortium have set out as the 20 key principles for age assessments, and Young Roots is a member of that consortium, and the Helen Bamber Foundation co-run that consortium. So and then our presenters will elaborate on a few of their chosen favourites. So I'm just going to read them out. Is that okay? You see the slideshow? Yeah, great. I'm just going to read them out, and you'll get sent these slides, and then our presenters will elaborate on them. So age assessment should only be undertaken as a measure of last resort. Age assessment should take the best interests of the child as a primary consideration. That holistic assessment of capacity, vulnerability and needs is preferred to estimating chronological age. We've talked a lot about this today. The holistic, impartial, multi-agency approach conducted over an adequate period of time. That the benefit of doubt be given to the child. That age assessments are carried out in a safe, child and gender sensitive manner with due respect to human dignity. To take into account the ethnic and cultural background of the child, because of course this impacts on age and how age presents. A person who is claiming to be under 18 should benefit from the rights of a child unless this would be clearly unreasonable. Is it going to let me move on? Yes. The procedures of the age assessments need to be clear and transparent, not least for young people themselves. Age assessments should not be carried out immediately upon arrival. So that's the Home Office age assessments we were talking about earlier. No method can determine age definitively, hence there will always be a margin of error. Medical age assessment methods are subject to a high margin of error and are not to be used. Assessments are overseen by an independent guardian if requested. There must be a procedure to appeal against the decision as well as support to do so. And as we're talking about, the IMA brings in provisions that only allows for judicial review, and it's not even a suspensive judicial review. So a young person could still be removed whilst trying to challenge that decision. If the young person is concluded to not be a child, they should be provided assistance and protection based on a comprehensive assessment of their protection needs and vulnerabilities. And I think the mental health research from Helen Bamber makes really clear that the age assessment process can cause harm to a young person, whatever the outcome of that age assessment. But holistic multi-agency support throughout, including connecting with peers, as Dan was talking about, a trauma-informed approach to age assessment, including supportive, non-confrontational environment, promoting trusting relationships, acknowledging the impact of trauma on testimony and the emotional impact of retelling a story. No change in living circumstances while the age dispute process is ongoing, including the opportunity for appeal or judicial review in our current system. Mediation and repair of relationships between unaccompanied children and young people, and social care following the age dispute if the young person is found to be a child, so that trust can be rebuilt, and greater oversight of how assessments are conducted and protections against coercive practice, with clearer channels for challenging the outcomes of inappropriate or coercive assessments. So that's 20 recommendations. We've also talked about legislation changes. We've talked about how there can be good guidance, but how does that follow through into practice? So maybe, Carmena, would you like to start with the recommendations that you'd like to focus on? And do you want me to carry on sharing so they're up on the screen?
Yeah, you're okay to go back to the beginning? Thanks. Yeah, so just to say, so these recommendations were in a response that the RMCC did to the Home Office's new plan for immigration, which feels like a lifetime away now, which basically set out a lot of the changes to law and policy that we've seen since. And this was our kind of original response, and these principles are not made up by the RMCC. They come from international law and kind of existing statements and sort of UN kind of committees and UNHCR and others. So we sort of tried to pull it all together as kind of, actually, this is what already sort of exists in terms of commentary on what would be best practice in this field, and this is what we should be sticking to. But I guess the ones that I wanted to touch on, which we've sort of said already, really, I think it's really important to note how far we've moved away from the idea of age disputes being a measure of last resort, and how far we've moved away from any really meaningful use of this kind of the sort of giving the benefit of the doubt in the context of age disputes. And I think one of the things that I've seen, I know I talk about the Home Office a lot, I'll continue to talk about the Home Office a lot. One of the things that I've seen that I think really adds to why we've moved away from that is that sort of rise in the initial dispute when the child's first interaction is with the Home Office. And that's not just children treated as adults, that's children with question mark over their age. That sort of it's definitely not because there's significant reason to doubt. It can just be, you don't have ID. We're not even going to check if you've actually got ID, because we're hearing repeated examples now of children arriving with documentation that they're not even given the opportunity to show to anyone. And so they're instantly, that question mark is put above their heads. We're also finding that with those visual assessments where children are then treated as adults, that follows them. Even though it's a visual assessment, later on down the line, it's given this kind of evidential weight that it shouldn't have. So, and a really clear example of that is in the criminal context, when children are being charged for offences, and that initial visual assessment is seen as kind of determinative that they are an adult. So I think that's really kind of problematic. And if I wanted to kind of really get back to sort of a good working system, those would be the kind of principles that I think we should focus on. And the other thing I just wanted to raise, which I don't have an answer to, but I think it's interesting that in my lifetime of working in this area, I haven't really seen any kind of progress, is that issue of vulnerability in young adulthood. the kind of the idea that it's not that this 18 cutoff points we've seen as being problematic in other contexts. We've had kind of court judgments talking about the kind of that it not being a hard and fast line, and we recognize that 18 is not the cutoff. That's why we have a whole leaving care system and an additional kind of support for people in who are being looked after into their kind of early 20s. But we really haven't managed to progress to this idea that if you are assessed to be over 18, you may still have additional needs. It's not just about kind of moving you into a system for adults that is fundamentally unsupportive and uncaring. So yeah, those would be the ones that strike me. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Angeliki and Ryan, either of you want to go next?
Yeah, I don't mind going. Angelique, you touched on them a little bit earlier. I guess it's probably important just to be clear is that the RMCC recommendations from 2021 were the first 15, and we've added a few based on these series of reports to make it a full 20, and hopefully it's clear which ones that connects to, but and I'll let Dan touch on the relevant ones from that report. But for us, taking a trauma-informed approach to the age assessment, so emerging from the experiences reported by the young people, both within the focus group and more broadly around the impact of having to repeatedly tell your story. And we know there's lots of research around the impact of having to do so, particularly if somebody's story is very difficult and very traumatic and often decorated by loss, and the experiences that led them to flee their home country in the first place, experiences on the way to the UK, and of course experiences after arrival very often as well. The no changing living circumstances comes from, again, these experiences of destabilization within the age dispute process, but also following a decision, and the impact that that can have on young people's mental health of course, not even just being moved, but potentially being moved all over the UK, and the impact that that can have when they've just started to build these fragile social connections that are so important that Dan really helpfully set out. To have those kind of suddenly and often very quickly torn away can be a replication in many ways of their experience when they fled in the first place. So we'd really support trying to keep living circumstances as consistent as possible throughout the process. And then the mediation and repair of relationships, I think, was an acknowledgement again of the impact that just the participation required of social workers and professionals in the process, and what's expected by professionals within the age dispute process can have a significant impact on the relationship between young people and social care in particular. And again, that's often a replication of feeling let down, feeling abandoned, feeling uncared for in other contexts in the young person's life. And as Angelique talked about earlier, that sense of higher threat, that higher sense of interpersonal threat of, are you going to be there for me? Are you going to abandon me like other people have had before? The age dispute process can really replicate some of those experiences. So, it's not a straightforward recommendation, we realize that, but hoping that that can be something that supports those that are conducting this assessment as well, is to have some avenues for repairing that relationship and rebuilding that sense of trust after the process. And again, it's not to say that the experiences we talked about today are representative of all age assessments, but there were examples of coercive practice that the young people reported and other young people have reported. So this final point is having greater protections and greater avenues and clearer channels for when age assessments are conducted in that manner, which we would say would undermine the outcome of an assessment conducted in that manner. And what are the avenues for support, but also the avenues for challenge for such assessments?
Thanks, Ryan. Angelique, do you want to come in on those ones as well, or anything else to add?
I think everything has been covered. Just a minor kind of thing to add on the point about no change in living circumstances. Something that we see a lot, other than, like as Ryan said, interrupting very valuable social networks and education and all of that. What we also see in terms of more in relation to direct relation to mental health is that, and health in general, actually, is that given that these young people that we see often do have complex physical and mental health difficulties, and it can take a long time for them to be able to access the right support, and that it's not just our type of support, but also NHS support, being moved from place to place can interrupt that. It means that they could be on a waiting list for a very long time, that then they have to go on the bottom of another waiting list and go through that process again. And we know how that lengthy can be in itself. So it means that they don't get the access to support for their health needs at the time that they need it. And the other thing that we have seen happening a lot is that it can interrupt ongoing treatment. So what we've seen, for example, sometimes we'll be in the middle of very difficult and taxing trauma therapy, for example, and an age dispute comes in, or an outcome of an age dispute comes in, and it can really, really destabilize and interrupt the recovery journey, or kind of like bring about new mental health difficulties that make it difficult to focus on kind of the things, the goals, the mental health goals that we started working on.
Thanks, Angelique. Dan, any that you'd like to focus on?
I think it's pretty much been covered, to be honest. Yeah, I think I would just add that I think generally the approach to age assessment should be to give the young person the best possible chance of demonstrating their age and showing their claim, demonstrating that they are the age they claim they are. And that involves the holistic approach that we've talked about a lot today, building networks for that person so they feel supported and that they know that they'll be supported post-age assessment, whatever the outcome. And things like not moving them between accommodations or not moving them in and out of care during that time. These are the kind of things that are really important in ensuring that you're going to make the best possible decision that you can. And that's really important because the risks of getting it wrong are so dangerous and terrible in lots of instances that we see. So I think it's really, that's really the overarching thing for me, is just to give people the best possible chance.
Thanks, Dan. We've had a few more questions come in. So we've got a little bit of time left. I think if that's okay, we'll cover them. I think maybe all of the speakers could answer this, so you can choose. Is there a standard method of age assessment? Till when can it be revised if there's doubts, or if a young person subsequently is found to be involved in criminal activity? I think it's probably worth saying that the criminal activity doesn't itself inform about age, it just informs how they are treated within the criminal justice process. But is there a standard method of age assessment? I think there's several answers to this. Does anyone want to take this one?
Has everyone avoided it because it's too big?
Compliant age assessment.
So I feel like we could allocate another 2 hours to what the. I mean, I think this is the kind of fundamental issue, isn't it? Is that if an age assessment is going to be done well, and it goes back to this idea that it needs to be a kind of holistic, multi-agency exercise where you're gathering a range of evidence from different people, including the young person. And I suppose what I think should be lauded about this country at the moment is that we do have this kind of psychosocial approach to age assessments, whereas compared to other European countries where the emphasis is much more on the medical side when it comes to determining age, despite the fact that that's been found to be kind of notoriously unreliable. And you've even seen sort of like very high profile kind of cases in Europe on that. So I don't think it gets said enough, and it used to always strike me when I was pre-Brexit, when I was involved in European projects, and I would go and we'd talk about the system in the UK, which we'd always find was quite a struggle, and then you go and go, actually, this is quite good. Like, if it's done well, it's good. It's like it's not quick, and it involves kind of resource and time, but it's much better than x-raying someone's wrist or checking their molars. So yes, I think I'll just sort of use that question as an opportunity to kind of make that point that we've got as close as you can get, I think, to a functioning system if it's done well.
And I think on the point of whether it can be revised, I think there are several ways in which age assessments can be challenged. I think it's just it's quite difficult for young people to access them, and so during the local authority age assessment process, there's a minded to stage where if the social worker has concerns or doubts about something the young person has said, there's an opportunity to respond to that. I think something Young Roots is working on another report at the moment based on some research about decisions, and it feels like there's quite an inconsistent practice in terms of what's called the minded to stage. Young people certainly have very different experiences of that, so there's maybe something about more consistent approach to that. And there are also legal challenges, which Dan has mentioned. So at the moment that would be a judicial review, but these are very difficult to do. You need legal representation, and we know that there's a legal aid crisis, and young people need to know that that's possible, and they really need to be supported through that process as well. Does anyone want to add anything about the standard method of age assessment?
I would add just to what you've just said about the court process. I think we have a number of cases, including especially there's examples in the report as well, of young people who go through that appeal process and spend 2 years. They claim to be 16, spend 2 years challenging the decision, are ultimately found to have been 16 all along, but are now 18, and they've missed out on the 2 years of care that they were entitled to, and they can never get that back. So I think, yeah, just to add that point in there.
Okay, go Angeliki.
Very quickly, I mean, I'm going to kind of add to the. I'm going to kind of replicate what psychologists are notorious for, asking questions rather than giving answers. But I think it's kind of like this reminds me of something that Kamena kind of touched on earlier about from a psychological perspective, and in general more from a philosophical perspective. I guess what we ought to kind of be thinking more about is where people are developmentally. And as Kamena said earlier, there will be 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds that I have much more vulnerability and support needs than certain 17-year-olds. And I think this is what's missed when kind of you're trying to kind of discover exactly how many days have lapsed from someone's birth. And that is, there are objective ways of doing that, but we're talking more about kind of like philosophically what kind of more radical shift in how we are assessing vulnerability and support needs.
Thanks, Angeliki. Just a point about the independent guardian recommendations, so maybe one from Kamena. Is this in addition to an appropriate adult in the age assessment or something else?
Yes, it would have. It feels guardianship is something that RMCC and others called for a very long period of time, until the kind of political climate moved in such a way that it felt too kind of blue sky thinking for this moment in time, but we'll probably revisit it. And yes, so that would be the kind of concept of having an independent guardian. And again, you sort of see this replicated in other countries in Europe, is about having someone who is independent from social services, from all those other points, and is the kind of fixed long-term support for the child going through the asylum process and through age assessments and through others. So that's something we've kind of long called for. We got a bit close with child victims of trafficking, but not with the kind of broader cohort of children seeking asylum. So that's where that kind of principle comes from, although I don't expect to see it anytime soon. And it's worth noting that even appropriate adults, which is a much smaller, much kind of short-term role in the concept of age, in the process of age assessment, is that we're increasingly seeing that is a difficult thing to achieve for a child in an age assessment, because there aren't the people and the organisations able to provide appropriate adults.
Yes, I think there's another point here about consistency, isn't there? It's like the appropriate adult methodology is quite different in different places. Another question from Gemma: one of the biggest difficulties our service faces is needing to close cases when there isn't any further casework action to be taken to challenge the age assessment. How do we do this without feeding into the feeling that young people are abandoned? We work remotely in Yorkshire, and it's often difficult to find any other organisations to refer people to for holistic support, and our capacity and way of working doesn't allow us to continue with open-ended support. It just feels quite a familiar difficulty for charities. In some cases, we've advocated for people to be moved from remote hotels close to cities to engage with youth services, which has been great, but often this isn't possible. I wonder, Angelique, if you wanted, or Ryan, if you wanted just to respond on that kind of maybe the abandonment question, then maybe there's more of a kind of organisational, operational response as well.
I mean, I think it's a really, really tricky question to answer. And I think not like every organization is different and how they kind of manage these endings when there's not much more to do. And you know, what I could say is that is kind of think about those processes of ending and how they can be done kind of slowly and gradually, and with giving opportunities to kind of find other networks and other kind of signposting organizations for the young people. But I completely appreciate how that can be very difficult, especially in remote areas. And I don't have no suggestions for that, other than we need more support and we need more resources across the country, really. And something that we do see is that it is very difficult for young people when they're moved outside of London and they move kind of those connections to that are they're not abandoned in London either, but they're more of in big cities, as you mentioned. So I think it is about us from organizationally and nationally thinking about how we can have more support in other areas as well.
We've got two more questions I'd quite like to take before we finish. If anyone wants to add anything onto that question, please do. Otherwise, I'll move on. We've got I
was just going to say super quickly, I guess it's a parallel experience that we have as psychologists. Is, you know, very often we input for a certain period of time, and of course that input has to come to an end. But even being thoughtful about the impact that the end of that relationship is going to have and giving space to that will make a difference, even if it won't stop that sense of abandonment from happening and that sense of isolation. You know, being thoughtful and giving space to that will make a huge difference.
Thanks for that, Ryan. I think that's a really important thing to note. Next question. I'm sure some people have been thinking it and maybe didn't want to ask, but what about scenarios when someone who initially claimed an age of 18 and under, and later during the age assessment admits they're a clear adult? Do you work with adults who claim to be children too? A difficult question. Dan, I'm going to throw this one to you.
Yeah, sure. I think that's the first thing to say is we there are scenarios where we work with people who've been determined to be adults, and that's reflected in the report as well. We find that that's much less common than people who are actually claiming to be children being found to be children. I think the other thing to say is that we don't support people's claimed ages if we know them to be untrue. Hopefully that goes without saying. But I think the other thing to say is that we don't just support age disputed people around age disputes. So if we might not be able to support an age dispute because we don't believe the person's age, or they've told us something that we disbelieve, told us something that leads us to disbelieve their age, but we might be able to support them in other ways. We might be able to support them to get a legal representative. We might be able to resolve a housing issue. We might be able to get them into suitable education or welfare provision. So I guess it ties into what I was saying earlier, is that wanting to build a network around someone that isn't wholly and totally responsible, that associated with the finite details of their age, or their particular age. So yeah, there are a handful of situations where we've worked with people who have been found to be adults down the line, and a handful of situations where people have told us that they are actually not the age they were originally claiming to be, and so we respond accordingly, as you would expect in those ways. The only thing to add to that as well, I think, sorry, briefly, is that we provide safe environments for people up to the age of 25. So, and the vast majority of people who claim to be children who aren't are young adults who would still fall into that category. So, yeah.
Thanks, Dan.
And I think that's also the importance of having services that are more focused on kind of like, let's say, up to 25 and like young adults as well. So you could provide the support that people need based on their needs and not based on, you know, how young they are in their young people journeys.
Thanks, Angeliki. Right, I'm going to finish with this question that, as a campaigner, I absolutely love. And I'm going to ask everyone just to give a very brief response. So the question is, if I were to talk about my learnings from this session with friends, family, and various other networks, and please do, what would be the best call to action I could add? We've talked a lot about recommendations. We've talked a lot about what's wrong. Does anyone want to dive in? Shall I start and then I'll allow others to have a think? I would say there's a lot here about changing in policy and changing in practice, but I think one of the most urgent things right now is that so many children are being wrongly found to be adults, and at the moment that includes facing the risk of being removed to Rwanda. So I think it's about raising opposition to the Rwanda scheme with our political representatives. The Rwanda scheme is wrong for everyone. Everyone deserves to be safe, and highlighting that because of this often flawed process, that it's inevitable, unless something is changed, that children will be sent to Rwanda. Who wants to go next?
I can go. Completely agree with what Lisa's just said, but I'm gonna go for something a little kind of like vaguer in a way, but it's thinking about the kind of political climate, and it's thinking about that at some point we might have a new government, and perhaps we can shift how we kind of our approach in general to people seeking protection in this country, because the age dispute system has become so sort of adversarial, and the rhetoric is all about, and this is not just limited to kind of age assessments, but it's all about abuse of the system and people coming here and trying to claim XYZ. And I think if we could shift away from that, so that we are our starting point is in the context of age, is that there's a person seeking protection who cannot demonstrate how old they are. Do we really need to do anything other than believe them? If we really can't just take their word for it, what then can we do to come to a view on their age in a way that is kind of supportive and that recognises that people seeking protection in this country have experienced a whole range of sort of terrible things before they got here? So how can we approach this whole area in a way that is supportive and doesn't cause further harm? So it's sort of vague, but I just think sometimes I think what we do have, if we have a new government, is a chance to kind of just let's go back to the beginning of what we're even trying to do and think about the kind of best system we can create.
Brilliant and hopeful. Thank you. Who wants to go next? We've got 2 minutes left. Like a radio show host.
So I'll go very quick. I mean, I think Kamena covered my thoughts very, very eloquently. So I mean, I'm just gonna reiterate, just go back to kind of the values of compassion and care, and think about these are young people that are kind of feeling fearful, mistrustful, confused, hopeless, over scrutinized and uncared for. And it's how we can kind of like go beyond the labels. The person is from X country and they are age disputed or not age disputed, and they are a migrant, and etc. And look at the specific person and what their story is, what their vulnerabilities, and what their needs are. And yeah, and whatever role you are, kind of have that person-centered approach and compassion.
Ryan?
Go on, Ryan. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll try and take a slightly different tack. You know, hopefully, certainly my learning from the research that we did, and you know, hopefully something that you can take away from today is the value of elevating the voices of the people that are impacted by the things that we're talking about. You know, because of the systems that we work in, we do a lot of doing for rather than doing with, and I think, you know, hopefully it's shown that there's immense value to giving space to what are people's actual experiences and what does that tell us about what might need to change and what might that look like.
Thank you, Ryan. That's really important. Dan, final words.
I think that was a great one to finish on, but I will crowbar in my own thoughts anyway. My feeling is that we just do way too many of these, and we know the harm it causes. We know the difficulty in doing it. We know the risks associated with doing it badly, but we still do so many. And actually, this should be reserved for cases where we really have to do it. The vast majority of cases, we don't.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters, and thanks to all of you who've given so much of your time to learn and share with us, and some really brilliant questions. We'll be in touch with the slides, with the report links, and at some point a recording of this webinar will be on YouTube, unfortunately with the annoying ding dong sounds because they're impossible to turn off. But thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to being in touch with all those resources soon. Bye everybody.